Hello and welcome. My name is Sarah Everts and I'm the CTV Chair in Digital Science Journalism here at Carleton University. And before we get going, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that this university, Carleton University, is located on the traditional and the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. Now, I'm also joined here, digitally at least, by Ed Yong, a staff writer at The Atlantic and a longtime science journalist who has written some of the most breathtaking and insightful pieces that we've seen on the COVID pandemic. It's a delight to have you here. Welcome, Ed.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, back in 2018, which feels like a lifetime ago, you wrote a deeply researched piece for The Atlantic about pandemic preparedness, or lack thereof, that predicted with alarming accuracy many of the challenges and the missteps that we've seen in the response to the novel coronavirus. Tell me how that story came to be.
Yeah, so my editor-in-chief, Jeff, and I have been talking about pandemic-related ideas for a while. This was an area that both of us were really interested in, and it seemed to me that I had heard a lot about the concept of preparedness and the importance of it, but I didn't really have a handle on what it actually meant. Like, it seemed quite an abstract, nebulous concept, and I wanted to put it in quite concrete terms for people. Like, who are the types of people who are involved? What does it mean to be prepared? Let's look at things like supply chains and hospitals and vaccine manufacturing capacities and all the rest. And I also wanted to ground that piece in a sense of like the psychological challenges. Like, why is it that as a society, as a species, we do so badly at being prepared for these problems? So it was actually really important to me that that piece came out at a time when there was no pandemic currently circulating around the world. 2018, there was, there was an Ebola epidemic in the DRC, which I actually went to. The epidemic started just after I left, and I think just before the piece came out. So a reminder that these threats are always present, but nothing was battering down the door of the United States at the time. And I think that's really important, because that's the time when you need to really shore up your defenses, need to invest in all the things that actually come to play in a crisis. And as we've seen this year, the lack of those investments and preparations have really cost us dearly.
Yeah. Now, I think for many in North America, mid-March was that moment of reckoning where we realized that this novel coronavirus wasn't just happening over there, it was happening right here as many regions went into lockdown, as schools closed. Tell me about your moment of reckoning, that place and time where you suddenly realized, oh my gosh, this thing that I wrote about in 2018 is playing out right now.
Yeah, I think it was more of a creeping, dawning realization over the early part of the year. In January and February, my mind was not fully on this. I was on book leave. I was focusing on one big project. It had my full attention, and I knew that the pandemic was brewing. I could see it changing from something that was just affecting China to something that was slowly spreading around the world, something that was making more of an impact in the US. And it was difficult at first, sort of weighing up those that responsibility of the big project that I was working on and had a deadline for versus this other topic that I'd reported on before and was also dear to my heart. And full credit to the many reporters who were on this right from the start. People like Helen Brandwell were on it from like week one. My colleagues Robinson Mayer and Alexis Madrigal were on the testing crisis right from the beginning. And so it got to a point like in mid-March when it was clear that the crisis was going to be of a large enough scope that it was going to be one of the defining stories of our generation. The Atlantic needed all hands on deck. I couldn't sort of not be on the story anymore. And so I got asked to come back from book leave and gladly jumped into the fray. But it's very rough watching the thing that you've written about before and sort of desperately hoped would never come to pass, but wanted to warn people about actually coming to pass.
Yeah, I can just imagine. And speaking of predictions, back in 2018, you wrote, at some point, a new virus will emerge to test Trump's mettle. What happens then? He has no background in science or health and has surrounded himself with little such expertise. And, you know, Trump has ultimately mismanaged the pandemic in so many different ways, it can feel a little overwhelming. From your bird's eye view, from your perspective, what do you see as his most egregious weaknesses or failures with the pandemic?
Well, there are what an abundance of riches to choose from. Okay, so a few things spring readily to mind. First and most crucially, his utter abdication of responsibility. You know, Trump is not a leader by any definition. He is very lazy. He shirks away from true challenges, shies away from true challenges, and you know, despite the fact that a pandemic is clearly a crisis that requires national, federal level coordination, that has just not been provided. You know, the plans that have been rolled out have been so vague as to be completely useless. Trump's posture has been largely to leave things up to governors, to other people, and that lack of coordination of the kind that only the federal government can really achieve has left the United States with this problem that it has had to try and resolve as 50 independent entities, probably many more, rather than a single coherent force. And I think that has been very costly. I think the other thing that we need to talk about is the president's repeated sowing of misinformation. You know, we need, in a crisis like this, someone who can provide clear, calm, authoritative, evidence-based communications. And we have had, you know, exactly the opposite of all of those things from the president on an almost daily basis. He has downplayed the severity of the virus, even when he knew that it was going to be serious. He has silenced and muzzled the mighty CDC. He has, you know, trumpeted wonder drugs like hydroxychloroquine. He has wondered out loud about the curative potential of injecting bleach into bodies. You know, I could go on. In the big cover story I wrote for The Atlantic, you know, there's a 212-word sentence about Trump's many, many misgivings. And I think the crucial thing to recognize here is that, you know, there are no dark arts involved in predicting how Trump would act in a crisis like this. I did it in 2018. I did it in 2016. I wrote a piece about how a pandemic would play out under a Trump administration after he won the election, but before he was even inaugurated, that laid out laid out much of what he has actually done. And, you know, it didn't take a lot of skill to do that. Trump has always shown us who he is, and his many failings were entirely obvious on the campaign trail when he was a citizen during the reaction to the Ebola epidemic in West Africa. It was all transparent. And in many ways, Trump is America as a microcosm in that respect. Like the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses were predictable and foreseeable beforehand.
Yeah, one of the issues that I worry most about is his politicization of the COVID-19 vaccine. By making false promises about its arrival and using it, it seems somehow, or trying to use it as a lever for re-election. What's your take on this? What is the long-term consequences of his politicization of COVID-19 vaccines?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's hard to say. We still have a few weeks to the election. I would be very shocked if there was a surprise vaccine announcement in that time frame, partly because, you know, I think there has been some pushback on from the actual scientific bodies involved. Even the scientific director of Operation Warp Speed has been clear about how the data just won't be there in time for a vaccine announcement pre-election. Now, we may well be surprised, but regardless, I think that you're right that the use of a vaccine as a sort of political cudgel, whether one arrives or not, whether approval happens or not, is damaging. It increases distrust. And, vaccines are an area where distrust was already a problem, right? We didn't need more distrust in vaccines. And now, some of the misgivings that people have had, I think, are entirely reasonable, right? Like if you had an announcement in the next couple of weeks, I would be skeptical about the merits of that. And so I think it worsens a lot of the problems that we've seen this year that are all part and parcel of a growing distrust of empiricism, of evidence, of institutions, of leaders. This isn't just about vaccines, it's about things like masks, it's about social distancing. Every part of the US pandemic response has been corrupted and warped in this way. And I think one of my concerns is that obviously the election is an important milestone in time. And if Trump wins a second term, I think we're in for a lot of trouble. But even if he doesn't, he's still a public figure. He's still going to be out there talking to his supporters, spreading misinformation. So this isn't just, we have the potential to change things on November the 3rd. It's not going to be a light switch. And I think that's really important to recognize just in general with the pandemic. There are no light switches, right? There's nothing that just flips us back to normal. A vaccine also won't do that and is subject to many of the same errors of intuition that I've written about that have trapped us in these bad leaps of thinking for the pandemic this entire year. And those errors of intuition are exacerbated by Trump, but they're not entirely dependent on him. And so it's sort of up to us science journalists and just citizens to try and resist these errors for the near and medium term future.
Yeah, just to take up on that, many people see the vaccine as this potential turning point when, as a panacea for getting back to normal. What's your reality check on that? Say, a vaccine is, approved in due process, with due process, in, the next few months. What are your concerns? Are we going to get back to normal right away?
So absolutely not. I think it's going to take a long time for even an effective vaccine that is approved through the a stringent regulatory process to actually help to turn the tide, if it does at all. There are questions about how effective is it going to be. One could be licensed if it was 51% effective. That is going to help. It's not going to immediately return us to 2019. That vaccine then still has to be, transported across the country, distributed fairly, widely, equitably. Is that going to happen? I have some doubts, given how well the US has risen, how poorly the US has handled logistical challenges throughout the year. We're still in a situation where we don't have enough personal protective equipment for many healthcare workers. And then you also have a lot of other, we've never done something like this before. There are infrastructure, of course, for rolling out and using childhood vaccines. But here you're thinking about vaccinating a large proportion of the population, a lot of elderly people who might not mount a sufficient immune response. There are issues with having to manufacture entirely new types of vaccines that we haven't really used and mass produced before. There are questions, obviously, about trust and communication. So there are all these complications. And I think a vaccine is part of the end game, but I think that people haven't fully grappled with how long we'll continue to need all the other stuff that we've been relying on: masks, testing, basic public health, social distancing, all the rest, at a time when a vaccine is approved. The vaccine is really only the beginning of the end. It's not the end.
Yeah. Thanks for that reality check.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know. Uh,
It is kind of
um,
a horrible position being a science writer this year, right? You're really stuck in a constant state of telling people it's bad. I mean, some bits could be good, but the good bits are probably less good than you think they're going to be.
yeah. Well, let's move on that theme then. Um, let's talk a little bit about the biology of the coronavirus, which you write about with such eloquence. So you've referred to COVID-19 as a starter pandemic. What
Mhm.
did you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think there is a sense that because this virus has wrought so much upheaval upon the world, that it must be singularly bad, and that the extreme nature of the pandemic must reflect some extreme quality of the virus itself. And you see that in just general discourse. You even see that in the scientific literature. I think there's a sense that this is a weird virus that is doing all sorts of things we've never seen before, where in fact, I think a lot of the things that we have seen, such as COVID's effects on lots of different organs, these long-term effects that I've written about with people who are experiencing long-haul symptoms, unusual aspects of the disease, a few cases of reinfections, all of this stuff, that it reflects some weirdness of the virus. I actually think that a lot of that is just due to the fact that it's a pandemic and we have millions of cases. And so outliers become more common. The variety of stuff we see is wider. And it's hard to work out how much of those strange phenomena are due to the virus itself and how much is just due to the fact that the virus is very widespread. I don't think that this is, anywhere near the worst case scenario that we could have been hit with. And in some ways that is both galling and terrifying. And in some ways it's, kind of a blessing. It depends how you look at it. But this is not as, there are other pathogens that are more transmissible, more contagious. There are others that have a much higher fatality rate. If COVID had swung to an extreme in either of those directions, I think we would be in much worse shape. And there is one counter argument against that, which is that it is, as I've described it, an anti-Goldilocks virus. Like, it's just bad enough in every way. That some people would argue that if it was worse in terms of, say, fatality rate, it would have been more obvious to watch it spread, and people would have freaked out more and and taken it more seriously right at the start. Or, if it had, for example, rather than disproportionately affecting the elderly, disproportionately killing children, that people would really have freaked out more and done more to control it at the start. I don't know if those arguments are true or not. There is, I think some merit in this idea that the virus was sort of just contagious enough, just sneaky enough, just to get past us, and then just bad enough to cause a lot of harm, but still leaving the door open to some of these, some of the misinformation that's circulating around. I don't think we would be having these ridiculous herd immunity debates if this virus was killing 50% of people infected, right? But that being said, it could be worse. And I think that's one thing that we need to internalize for the future, right? That this is not the worst it could have been. The fact that the world, the US in particular, has done so badly at controlling it really should be a wake-up call and a reason for quite radical introspection and humility.
Yes, agreed, 100%.
Yeah.
As someone who follows the coronavirus's science, and there's new articles out on a daily basis, what has struck you from a bird's eye view as being some of the most surprising or nefarious aspects of the virus? What has struck you as being most interesting about it in a macabre kind of way?
Yeah, I think in terms of the basic biology, the issue of asymptomatic spread has been absolutely crucial. and the issue of its over dispersion. So the fact that super spreading events are really important, that a lot of people who are infected seem to infect almost no one, and some people infect a ton of people. Both of these phenomena, I think, could be really crucial to understanding the spread of the virus and to thinking about some of the control measures that are important. I think compared to the discourse in March, we would certainly want to upweight the use of masks, the importance of good ventilation, being outdoors, and maybe downplay the importance of things like surface cleaning. Hand washing obviously is still important for infection control, but I don't think it's going to be the make or break for this particular disease. I think messages about people in prolonged proximity in poorly ventilated spaces without the protection of masks, those are so important. Things about what else is important? I've mentioned this already, but I am still really struck, worried by, fascinated by the long-term consequences of infections. I think there is this group of people, long haulers, who have not had symptoms bad enough to send them to hospital, but certainly bad enough to debilitate them for months on end, have severely compromised their quality of life and their health, that a lot of these people still can't even get the merest dint of recognition of their problems, let alone medical attention or answers. I think it's fascinating the way they have found community for themselves, advocated for themselves, formed ties with people from other chronic illness communities like ME and dysautonomia who have dealt with these problems for a long time. I think that there is a sense in which COVID, because of its severity and the attention being paid to it, can shine a light on these other aspects of viral illnesses that were not unknown, but had been dismissed, and perhaps wrongly so. I also wrote recently about effects of COVID on the heart. There's been a lot of worry about what this virus might increase the risk of viral myocarditis, inflammation of the heart. The thing is, a lot of viruses cause myocarditis, including really familiar ones. We don't pay attention to it, and we don't know what proportion of those cases progress to heart attacks and heart failure versus resolving on their own, because people aren't looking at people's hearts when they're just getting normal respiratory viruses. And now they are, and there's a large amount of panic, which is not great, but there's also this chance to actually understand a lot of basic aspects of virology that we didn't really get a handle on before.
So interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the news media's coverage of the pandemic and how they've managed to do. In a matter of weeks, health reporting went from a niche beat to the purview of literally every general assignment reporter across the world. Suddenly, sports journalists are writing about cytokine storms, right?
Right.
From your perspective, how has the news media as a whole done in covering public health during the pandemic? How have they done getting up to speed?
It's really hard to generalize, I think. I see both positives and negatives, and I think I have a slightly different take on this than probably a lot of my science journalist colleagues. I think there's a sense from the field, like our field, that reporters with specialist knowledge would do the best job with this, and that a lot of the poorest reporting comes from people from different beats who've sort of hopped into this without any sort of previous background or without that specialist knowledge. I definitely see some of that. I would note that a lot of people who work in science and health reporting were not science and health specialists in the first place. So they learned those skills on the beat. And I see reporters among my colleagues who are not science and health reporters in traditional ways, but who have leapt onto the story with tremendous skill. Alexis Madrigal and Robinson Mayer have been among the top reporters on the testing story, and they were respectively tech and climate reporters before this. My colleague Amanda Marr has done amazing work, and she is a health reporter, but she is, she defines like her own health beat, right? She's not an infectious disease reporter. Derek Thompson is an economics writer, and has done a fantastic job. So, I think there are tons of people who aren't science and health reporters who have really come onto this and done incredible work. I think a lot of it comes, I think there's two reasons for that. I think we often, as a field, overweight the importance of specialist subject matter expertise and underweight the importance of just craft, right? Like, I think a lot of people with really excellent just journalistic skills have been able to pivot very effectively because they know how to do things like synthesize a large amount of knowledge very quickly, how to delimit the bounds of their own knowledge and stretch it appropriately through interviews, how to contact a lot of people and find out information, from the right sources. And I think those skills have been really important. That being said, a lot of health reporters, a lot of health and science reporters really have led the way in terms of the coverage. So I've already talked about Helen Branswell, who I'm sure needs no introduction to this audience. There are so many others. Roxanne Kamsey has been amazing. Maggie Kuth, Julia Bellas. I'm forgetting so many, but like there are people who I think have really risen to the challenge here. There's also a lot of bad reporting out there, I'm sad to say. And it's hard for me, like, as someone who I think tries very hard to find and promote people I know are good, to sort of get a sense of the proportions of those. I know that I got into journalism in the first place, not because of some like aspiration to join this noble profession, but because like I was first a scientist and then a science information officer who was at a cancer charity, who was woefully annoyed at the quality of reporting on the topics that I was covering. So, I've come into this from a kind of antagonistic side route, and throughout the pandemic, I've been delighted at just how much quality reporting there is. But there's also a lot of weak stuff. I think our tendency to treat the published paper as like the atomic unit of science journalism does us poorly in this crisis. I'm not saying like people should never write up about single papers, but I think that the choice to do so is harder now than under normal circumstances. There's so much information out there, and I think people are drowning in it. And just covering every bit, every little bite-sized package of information as it comes out, I think can just add to that feeling of being overwhelmed rather than helping people actually make sense of what is happening. And I think a lot of the work that I and other colleagues of mine at The Atlantic have been trying to do has been to try and synthesize, to try and do big sweeping pieces that look across a large amount of information, and also that don't treat this just as a science problem. Like, it's not just a science story, and I think we're wrong to treat it as such. It's a sociology story, it's an anthropology story, it's a politics and culture story. Every beat has a role to play on this, and every beat also has to deal with every other beat. So I might have an advantage as a science reporter, but I have no sociology training, I have no politics training, and I needed to jump into those fields. And I'm not seeing reporters in those fields saying, who is this interloper coming in without any sort of politics background or sociology background? I think like it's interesting to me that a lot of that rhetoric is coming from us rather than from all the other people whose beats are also actually really relevant to the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a point well made. Speaking of craft, which you've brought up, I know a lot of journalists are humbled that you manage to step out of the thick of COVID news and get a big picture, and then write these eloquent kind of bird's eye view assessments of what's going on, all while still posting on social media and keeping up with the New York Times crossword puzzle. So like everybody has their own strategy for writing and reporting. What is yours?
Firstly, it's been very hard. Like, if you told me at the start of this that my reaction as a journalist to this pandemic was going to be to write, like, I think it's now 14 like 5,000 word features in a row, I would probably have told you that was a very unlikely and also a terrible idea. So I think partly it's a lot of that comes from just the Atlantic and my editors. Like when I came back from book leave, I thought I was just going to do like normal news stories. And I was told right from the start, what we want you to do is to take the biggest possible swing and to really go big and to do something that is analytic and that synthesizes and that gives that big sweeping view while still maintaining like the rigor of just normal day-to-day reporting. And that's what I tried to do. So, there was definitely that, like I was mandated to do that and given the space and time to do that. I wasn't told, like, I want you to write, we want like one piece a day on the pandemic and also one big feature every 2 weeks. It was like, we will give you the space to do the big features. If you need to like just step away for 2 weeks to do that, do it. Turns out 2 weeks is not a ton of time, but okay, so a few things on the craft then. One crucial thing has been just finding the right people. And finding the right people across a bunch of different disciplines. So not just epidemiologists and virologists, but also the other areas that I've talked about, sociologists, medical anthropologists have been amazing. Scholars who study disability have just been like my MVPs throughout this. There are so many different areas of folks who have really changed and shaped and improved my understanding of the broader context of the pandemic. That's been really important. I think that a lot of the skills that I've accumulated just doing normal reporting, like just normal daily, like paper of the day science reporting, have been really useful here. So being able to work quickly, interview efficiently, all of those things come into play. I think that I'm a massive structure nerd, so I outline and structure things very intensely before I even start writing, and that has been incredibly useful here. And I'm just trying my best to stay on top of all of it. It's really hard. Like I think doing all of that work plus looking at the kinds of conversations that people are having on social media, finding the right sources, constantly trying to find new sources, right? Like almost every piece I've written, at least half of the people I've talked to for the first time. So I'm continuously trying to find new people to expand like the perspectives that I'm getting. And again, I'm going to go back and give more credit to my colleagues. I think The Atlantic has built a very generative collegiate atmosphere. We have a very active Slack. We have people discussing what the right angles are, what the right things that are coming up are, and we're constantly trying to stay ahead of the game. Trying to anticipate the stories that are going to be big, like 2 weeks down the line, a couple of months down the line. Like what are the sort of public servicey angles that we can give to people? So the very first piece I wrote when I came back from book leave that went huge, how the pandemic will end. I think that was the right piece for the right time. That so many people were just starting to grapple with the reality of the pandemic and didn't know what was going to happen. I think laying out the near and far future for them made that piece really land. And since then, I've tried to write pieces that I hope not only sort of do double duty, right? They sort of give people a sense of where we are and also where we might go in the future and what are the things that we need to think about. So pieces like the pandemic spiral piece, or like, so what are the areas of intuition that have trapped us so far? How are they going to play out in the future? So it's not just saying, here is what is happening, but it's also saying, here is how to think about what is happening. And I think it's that extra layer of analysis that The Atlantic very specifically tries to shoot for and cultivate, this idea that we help people to work out how to think about the news rather than just giving them the news, is a core part of what we're doing, and I think informs a lot of the coverage that I and others have done in the pandemic.
Really interesting. Another question in the craft vein is, as many journalists have been writing or trying to do big picture pieces, they've relied on military analogies. They've relied on, battle metaphors, silver bullets, winners, losers, and you've been really cautionary about this sort of framing. Can you tell me a little bit more about why that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So, firstly, I will raise my hands and say that I've absolutely done this myself too. I've talked about fighting. I've talked about, a lot of us have written about like frontline workers, right? That military terminology so insidiously creeps into the way we talk about this. And there's some good reasons for that. That there is a degree to which this is a fight. There is I think, in terms of large, massive crises that consume societies for a protracted period of time, this is much more like a war in that sense than it is, say, a hurricane or a natural disaster that is geographically isolated and temporarily protracted. So that, I understand the gravitational pull of the war metaphor. I wrote a piece on immunology where I compared T cells to like grizzled mercenaries in a bar, but like my rule even there was like, you get one war metaphor and it better be a good one. But the reason I think it's problematic is that these metaphors of fighting, of disease and sickness as being about fighting an enemy, battling against cancer, all of that kind of language, is insidious for several reasons. Firstly, it wrongly equates strength, whether you're talking about physical strength, like just musculature, or mental strength and like optimism, with health and recovery, right? And we know it's much more complicated than that. Sure, like if you have good health beforehand, you have a lower risk of dying from COVID, but very fit, young, healthy people have fallen sick. Many of the long haulers are like athletes, right? People in the prime of their health. Your mental state can affect your health, but it's not like people can just will away their sickness, and often their mental state reflects some kind of prior advantage, right? So it's much easier to not have chronic stress if you've lived a life that doesn't foist chronic stress upon you. So that's one reason. The other reason is that if you unite strength and fighting with health and recovery, then you automatically create a link between sickness and death and weakness and failure. So you're saying people who died are weak and are losers. And you're not only saying that they're weak in terms of physical weakness, but because we use the same language of strength and fighting and combat to talk about like our physical traits, mental traits, moral traits, temperamental traits, geopolitical power, all of these things, the meanings bleed from one metaphor to another. And so if you say that people who, lost their battle against, if you're talking about people losing a battle against a disease, you're equating their death with physical weakness. And you're also therefore equating that with moral weakness, with mental weakness, and all those other kinds. And there's a history of actively conflating those things. So I wrote a piece about why strength metaphors are a problem. And, you know, a lot of the anthropologists I talked to, again, so valuable, talked about this movement called muscular Christianity, which was started in the 19th century in Britain, moved to the US, deliberately conflated these ideas of exercise, of rugged fitness with moral strength and superiority. This ties into the creation of the YMCA. It ties into Teddy Roosevelt trying to overcome his childhood asthma and creating this very like tough guy, cowboy exterior. But then at its core, this movement is a misogynist movement, right? It's a reaction to what was perceived as this soft feminization of church and like everyday life. And then as it grows, it starts dragging in imperialist ideas. It starts dragging in white supremacist and eugenicist ideas. And obviously it has at its core a ton of ableism. You know, you're saying that people who have disabilities are morally inferior. And so all of these uses tie into our modern day use of strength and battle metaphors. That you cannot escape the fact that there is an inherent sexism and racism and ableism to all of these things, which obviously manifests when someone like Donald Trump starts talking about, you know, his good genes and, you know, his ability to beat the virus. And when he talks about strength, he's not just talking about the areas that we talked about. What he's really referring to are two things. Like, one is the projection of strength, and this very masculinized, toxic version of strength, where it's really all about aggression and volume rather than the actual like physical or mental strength. And he's talking about privilege, right? So he's talking about the fact that he has access to 3 drugs, including some experimental cocktail most people have never even been near. He gets airlifted to the hospital. He gets the best possible medical care. And yeah, I think, you know, this is a very long answer to your question, but it's tricky. I think all of this should make us be very wary about the metaphors and the language we use and all the historical contexts of those phrases and usages. Like if anyone should be cognizant of and very watchful of the context of the words, it's surely us, right? It's surely journalists who live by our words. And yeah.
Thanks. It was deeply.
I've been thinking about this a lot recently, so.
You know, also, you know, another thing that journalists are struggling to kind of parse or to figure out, and I know that a lot of newsrooms have had conversations of this ilk. They've been grappling with how to balance their role in reporting public health directives, like almost PSAs, right?
Yeah.
With their fundamental journalistic responsibility to hold people in power, including public health officials, accountable. Yeah, that's a balance. How do you juggle? How do you balance that? How should we be balancing that?
Yeah, it's hard, I think, because it's hard for a number of reasons. I think you're right that there is a certain amount of, you know, I think one can say that we are not like doing public health announcements, right? We're not doing PSAs, but we kind of are. Certainly in some of the more like public servicey pieces that we at The Atlantic have written, you know, we've written pieces about like, what should you do about like ordering takeout or, you know, seeing family and this, and like our readers want to know the answers to these things. And sure, like you can report them out and you can contact a bunch of different experts and do like the basis of the job. But at the end of the day, the line between that and doing a sort of PSA is very thin. I think the way in which it still is important is that we are not, you know, we're not like a mouthpiece for the CDC, for example. Like if there is disagreement, it is our job to talk about that. So, you know, there are disagreements about things like, well, there have been about things like masks in the early days, about aerosol transmission, about, you know, the piece I wrote about how COVID affects the heart was really interesting in that there was actually quite a lot of controversy about scientists about what exactly this means. And, you know, I think it is our job to talk about those controversies without, you know, without necessarily like, you know, without sort of lashing ourselves to one side or another. Like, that being said, we know, like, as a field from hard experience, that there are areas where false balance is a problem, right? Like, we know from covering vaccines, from covering climate change and evolution, all the rest, right? That there is this problem of like, you know, all these means of like teach the controversy, like both sidism, like all of those issues come into play here. So, you know, sure, like let's talk about, you know, we can write pieces about, I don't know, this herd immunity debate as an example. But I think it's important then to recognize that actually the balance here is heavily weighted on one side. That it's not like everyone is saying the same thing, but it's not like there are two camps of people who are equal in number and who are both making very strong points. Like, so we have to be very, very cautious about like our ability to sort of gauge strength of evidence, sort of degree of consensus, all of these things. I think it's also hard. This balance is difficult also because a lot of us have been at this for months now, and it's very draining. You know, we have a lot of us, there aren't that many science journalists, there aren't that many public health people. And by just dint of the job and the protracted nature of the crisis, a lot of us are relying on the same people again and again as sources. And it's hard not to sort of find an affinity with people who have basically been in the trenches, there we go with another war metaphor, for months, right? But we still have to create a certain amount of tension there. Like, you know, our sources are not our mates. And, you know, we're not like, and, you know, we have to be cognizant of all the sort of dynamics at work on the academic side of things. I think that is a difficult balance to strike when there are people who, you know, who you're grateful for their time, you know, they're struggling personally, you basically agree with them, and you're grateful for like the help that they're giving you in sharing their expertise. Like, despite all of that, I think one still has to maintain a certain amount of distance.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, you know, this, as you've mentioned before, there's been an obscene amount of misinformation with this pandemic. What do you see as, you know, the balance, the sweet spot for newsrooms as they decide, you know, should we focus on writing or producing pieces that debunk misinformation, or should we be focusing on the fire hose of COVID-19? I mean, do you see a sweet spot? How, you know, do you think it's worth that, you know, mainstream media focus on debunking, perhaps full time?
I do see a sweet spot, and I don't know if this is, you know, I'm not saying that everyone should do this, but I'll tell you how I'm thinking about the problem. So I think that the problem is not only that there is a lot of misinformation, but that misinformation, by vice of the platforms that we distribute our news to, travel further and faster than accurate information. Like, we've all seen this, right? We know how fast lies and conspiracies can cascade through things like Twitter. We know that the algorithms that govern those platforms are geared towards extreme viewpoints rather than things that are actually true. And we know that if we try and debunk something, it takes time to do that. And the debunking thing never goes as far as the lie that it is meant to address. which is very demoralizing. Like, how do you deal with that? And I think that my strategy is to try and always play a future offense while playing any kind of defense. So rather than just say, you might have heard this thing, it is wrong, let me explain. I'm also trying to say, try and arm people with the knowledge they need, sense of similar categories of wrong things in the future. So think of it almost like a vaccine, right? It's not a therapeutic, it's a vaccine. It's a sort of mental, conceptual vaccine that helps people make sense of what is to come. So for example, I wrote this piece about, there was this very widely shared story about a supposed new strain of the coronavirus that was much more transmissible than previous ones. It went like super viral based on, I think, just like a press release. And I wrote a piece about strains that talked about that story, but that also dealt with like, what actually is a strain and how do we know when something is a new strain or not? What kinds of evidence would the people I'm quoting as being skeptical need to accept that there is another strain? How long will it take to gather that evidence, and how will we know when we have it? So it's not just, this thing you heard is wrong. It's also saying, you will probably hear many things of similar kinds of wrongness in the coming months, and here is how to think about those things. So again, it's this idea of not just giving people the news, but helping people to think about the news, and not just helping them to think about the news in the moment, but think about the news in the future. So a lot of the work that I've tried to do, writing pieces about how the pandemic will end, this pandemic spiral that we're trapped in, an earlier piece about why the pandemic is so confusing, is all about these ideas, like trying to give people a solid conceptual basis for interpreting this massive swirl of information that is constantly coming and being added to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in terms of the media moving forward, I'd just like to wrap up with two questions actually. In terms of your advice to mainstream media writ large, what are some of the things moving forward that they should focus on as the second wave hits, or the first wave continues, as the case may be? What words of advice would you have? What were the stories that were missed, the first wave, that people should be focusing on? What were the mistakes made by the media? Do you have any thoughts or advice moving forward?
That's a really good question. And it's sort of the question that I think I'm going to come up with a great answer to, like sometime tonight, after we've stopped this call. I don't know. I'm a little hesitant to answer this because I'm aware that I have not seen 100% of what is out there, and I don't want to say like, oh, we missed this story, only for some reporter to very rightly say, actually, I covered it. I think that happens a lot, and I kind of don't want to do that. I think what I will say is that I think I'm not saying that the approach that we've taken of doing these big swing pieces has been like the only one that people should pursue, but I do think that there is a reason why they have resonated with our readers so much. They have consistently done really well. I think they have provided a valuable public service, and I think that one of the things that I hope the pandemic makes us do as a field is to think hard and reevaluate like our values as journalists. Like, what actually are we trying to do here? What are our instincts, and do they serve us well and our readers well at a time like this? Like, does the tendency to look at something like this and like find every possible angle and do like 100 different stories, is that the right way forward? Or do you just want like 5 stories that really hit hard and hit home with people. I don't know the answer to that. I'm not saying that the second thing is the right one, but I think that we slip into this very kind of reflexive mode when events like this happen, where we want to produce as much and as fast as possible, right? It's the nature of news coverage. And I don't know if that actually leads to greater public understanding. And I certainly don't think it does when we aren't actually taking the time to do the basics of the job, like the basic due diligence, right? And by that, I mean things like, if you're writing about, okay, fine, if you want to write about like a new study, go ahead. But for God's sake, like, get outside comment, right? Like, there is no time, there is no need for coverage that is just like a 400-word write-up of a paper with only like the lead scientist quoted, or like a preprint or a press release or anything like that, right? It just doesn't help. Like, we should be trying to double down on the best practices of our field, like what we can truly hope to achieve when we're doing the most rigorous, the most ethical, the most impactful possible journalism. And I recognize that there is a certain amount of privilege in saying this from an institution like the Atlantic, which has given me the space to do that, and that not every reporter has the space to do that. I guess I'm not saying this just to reporters themselves. I'm also saying it to editors, to publishers, to the entire industry. Like, the Atlantic has proven this year, I think, that high quality, deep, long pieces can find their audience. We have had record numbers of subscribers, like just ridiculous numbers of subscribers this year, and often directly on the back of work that is free. You know, most of our pandemic pieces, almost all of my pandemic pieces are outside of the paywall. And I can't tell, I have personally accounted for like thousands of people subscribing to our magazine. And that is astonishing, because that's not people going, I need to read this, I guess I'll subscribe. That is people going, I have read this and can read all of this for free, but I am impressed enough and find enough value out of it to give you money. And I think that is such an important lesson, that if we double down on quality and if we give writers the space to do their best work, readers notice.
Well, what a place to wrap up. I think that that's great advice, and I really do appreciate your time today. Thank you so much for joining us, Ed, and yes, stay safe, stay well, and thanks.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much for having me and giving me this opportunity. Stay safe to everyone here. You know, keep doing it. We need it. I hope you're all okay.